And joining me now for more on all of this is John Park. He's the director of the Korea Working Group at the Harvard Kennedy School. Dr. Park, good to have you here. And I want to jump right in asking you, what do you think is North Korea's strategy? And is Kim Jong Un to be trusted that he will operate in good faith?
Well, first of all, Ethel, we're looking at the transportation of the totality of the North Korean leadership regime to Singapore. So that gives a sense that this isn't just purely for the optics aspect of it. This is a big part of the idea of the potential launch of a process that could lead to a lot of the details that could lead to an end of the Korean War, this idea of what would a denuclearization process look like. There's a lot at stake, and this is really the idea of beginning of that process. The notion of trust, there's deep distrust on both sides. But one thing we have to look at is that these two leaders are clearly unconventional by the standards of their respective countries. And so there is a streamlined approach now for these two leaders to engage and potentially launch this process that we'll see going forward.
And indeed, President Trump saying, yeah, this is going to be more than a photo app. So what should President Trump say to Kim Jong Un in this meeting?
I think a lot of those things have already been said. One of the key things, if you look at it, we've seen a unique array of personnel. We've seen relationships that have been developed, and we are now potentially seeing the beginning of a very robust process going forward. There are going to be a lot of ups and downs in that process, but there clearly is the indication of the forward movement. If you look at it, Secretary of State Pompeo is a critical player here. He's already met with Kim Jong Un twice. We've had Kim Yong-chol, essentially Kim Jong Un's main advisor, in the White House. So in terms of this early consultation, this type of interaction, this lays something of a foundation for the Singapore summit to go forward.
Yeah, definitely a lot of groundwork that has been covered. I want to get to that in a moment, but I want to ask you right now, Dr. Park, should the U.S. stand steadfast that it's denuclearization or bust?
Right now, there's so many different moving pieces here, Ethel. If you look at it, there is a component that, in many respects, the larger game plan is this idea of how do we link the different mechanisms. The South Koreans have had their big summit. April 27th, South Korean President Moon Jae-in met with Chairman Kim, and they laid out something called the Panmunjom Declaration. The key part about moving forward with the big projects between North Korea, South Korea, and potential Chinese involvement here as well, developing the economy and so forth. The early lifting will be done by South Korea and China. But in order to get there, there has to be progress on the denuclearization piece. And the idea that it's going to be a complex task is a big focus on this denuclearization mechanism, this denuclearization process.
So is that a yes? Is it denuclearization or bust or not?
Denuclearization is going to be a key component, but the managing of the expectations is this idea of who does what, where, when, and how. So the idea, yes, it is the core element, but it's how it's done is going to be a big basis of how much we see the net forward movement.
Let me get your assessment of the two differing approaches to this summit. President Trump relying on his gut instincts to suss out Kim Jong Un. He says he can read him within a minute of meeting him. And then you have Kim Jong Un coming in very studied and, according to reports, with an interest in details.
Well, one thing is that if you look at a lot of the footage, and we have a tremendous amount in a relatively short period of time about Kim Jong Un. Before just a few months, he was an enigma. The information that we had was really pieced by the interlocutors that he met with. And until we had Secretary and then Director of CIA Pompeo meet with Kim Jong Un, the previous American citizen to have met directly with Kim Jong Un was Dennis Rodman. So you see this kind of scale of the types of people that Kim Jong Un is meeting with, but he's very measured in his meetings. And so with that, I think this idea of the words and the dialogue on the North Korean side will be very measured. From President Trump's side, I think is a gauging of, is this the interlocutor that I can make the deals going forward? And this idea of a very complex process. There's no easy feat in even launching the denuclearization mechanism. It's this idea that in starting this, there will be a lot of contentious issues coming up along the way, but can the two of them resolve those issues ahead is the key component here.
And how key are they? I mean, you've got these two really larger-than-life personalities. How key are these two players? I mean, you've already laid out for us the road leading up to this in terms of the groundwork that has been taking place. What about these two leaders themselves? Does the buck stop with them?
It looks like with the two structures, we're seeing a streamlining of processes that make it look like that's the case. So in terms of indicators, it's unprecedented how we've seen the top-down approach. The two leaders have agreed to move forward, and they've delegated key individuals to make that happen. but it's different from previous periods where we have almost a middle up, so middle level working groups, and then you escalate higher up as you see more progress. But in terms of these individuals, they are unique in the sense that this is very much about deal making per se.
Yeah.
And so the idea of the traditional models and way negotiations have done in the past, they factor in, but it is very specifically on these individuals and how they see the path ahead.
Now let's talk about the roles played by different nations leading up to this meeting. We're going to start with South Korea. You touched on that a bit. And I like to describe it as President Moon scraped off the plaque of the relationship between the two Koreas in advance of this.
Well, if you look at it, the South Korean side, if you recall the events just before the Panmunjom declaration, we saw diplomatic breakthroughs, the use of the Winter Olympics in South Korea as really the beginning of this process. But the South Korean side and President Moon, they've assumed a lot of the early risk. And with that, it's created a certain type of momentum that other parties have built upon. But I think if you look at the South Korean role in all this, they will seek to try to close gaps. When there was early gap between President Trump and Chairman Kim, South Korean President Moon did a lot in terms of trying to close those gaps, and he's had the one-on-one interactions, and he has that unique role to play going forward as well.
And then what about China, Russia, Japan?
So on the Chinese piece, there's more on the background side. Even some of the high-profile events that we've seen have become background noise in many respects. Kim Jong Un has met with Xi Jinping twice now. And if you look at a lot of the preparations and the help that the North Koreans have been getting from the Chinese side, it's remarkable. Chairman Kim arrived in Singapore on a Chinese aircraft, a Air China 747. And if you look at the airspace in which he journeyed through, there's a lot to be said about this support coming from the Chinese side. They're very keen on seeing progress moving forward. Russia is still in the background. I think this idea of trying to establish a direct connection. Chairman Kim hasn't met with President Putin yet, but there's some works that we've seen some progress in that area as well. Prime Minister Abe right now, I think, is trying to get that kind of connection. And if we see the broader movement in these different mechanisms, there could be a space. But right now, because of the central focus on getting this denuclearization process underway, that would basically create the political space for other mechanisms to get underway. We're putting a lot of focus on this meeting in Singapore.
Yeah. Leading up to this meeting in Singapore, as represented in this photo that I want to pop up here, is posted by German Chancellor Angela Merkel's camp, president coming from the G7 meeting. There were clearly some contentious moments. And now you have this Twitter feud with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and President Trump. Does this affect President Trump's momentum or leverage on a level going into this summit with Kim Jong Un?
I think it's important for the U.S. team to make that differentiation. That is a multilateral gathering. There's a lot in terms of legacy issues. And there's also been some issues in between the bilateral relationships between President Trump and the respective European leaders. But with respect to something like the upcoming summit, this is going to be all new, and it's bilateral. So I think in one sense, the comparison is multilateral and bilateral. In a bilateral setting, we've seen this U.S. president feel more comfortable, and this idea that it's essentially in control. He's in control in that bilateral setting. So I think in that dynamics, it's important to shift the focus and appreciate that this is a different setting.
Got it. Dr. Park, finally, of course, everyone is hopeful for a positive outcome. Where are the consequential pitfalls?
Sure. First, in the North Korea analysis field, it still tends to be the single event analysis. Something happens and we look and try to read the tea leaves. Right now, I think it's important to widen the aperture and look at how a lot of different countries doing different things in a bilateral and in some cases trilateral settings. But in terms of what to look for, I think this idea of a joint statement of some kind, we're laying out the key goals of the respective countries here. The United States looking at reducing this threat from the North Koreans and also moving forward with denuclearization. From a North Korean perspective, the potential elimination of the hostile policy and security guarantee, that would lead to the basis of the official launch of this denuclearization process. So these are the areas that a lot of work has already been done. And so rather than going to the table and negotiating from scratch, I think it's this idea of reviewing what has been achieved up till now and making this decision of the official launch of this overall denuclearization process.
I'm going to throw in another question, actually, because I want to ask you, what do you think would be considered realistic expectations coming out of this meeting?
So already we've seen the managing of expectations, but the realistic steps forward, I approach it from a slightly different angle, is this idea of a lot has been done below the surface. And that's the part that I think we're going to see more of after the summit itself. But the fact that this has been in the works for a while and at the highest levels, that's a piece of it that I think we're going to see the announcement of things that have already been more or less agreed to.
A lot has been done beneath the surface. Okay, so we're going to call this the submarine summit. How about that, Dr. Park? Really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you very much for your perspective, sir. Good to